So welcome, folks. We appreciate your leadership and your punctuality. At SETSI, as you know, we always begin on time and we end on time. But when we begin any session, whether it be a capacity building session or a panel, a presentation, discussion, we always want to give thanks to our ancestors. We want to give thanks to the creator. We want to give thanks to our elders and all the community stalwarts whose shoulders we stand on. So we share, build, learn, and cultivate the energy that we require. So we have a remarkable guest today. We have our brother Shadi Hafez, who's doing some remarkable work in community. I don't want to butcher Shadi's, by any means, I do not want to butcher Shadi's bio. So what I am going to ask Shadi to do is to introduce himself. So Shadi, please feel free to introduce yourself right now for us.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, thanks, Victor, for having me here and for asking me to speak with everyone today. I'm really honored and humbled that you'd asked me to come and speak today on the topic. So, my name is Shadi Hafez. I'm Algonquin and Anishinaabe and Syrian. I'm a member of Kitigan-Zibi and Anishinaabe. We're an Algonquin community just located north of Ottawa, Ontario. It's where my mother's from, and my father's a first-gen immigrant from Syria. Came here in the mid to late 80s. I live and work on my ancestral territory here in Ottawa, Ontario, and I work for the National Association of Friendship Centers as their programs manager. National Association of Friendship Centers represents nationally a little over 100 friendship centers across the country. Those are urban Indigenous civil society institutions. They offer a wide array of programs and services to urban Indigenous people, and have been around since roughly the 50s, 1950s, where some of the first friendship centers in the country opened up as Indigenous people started moving from the reserves into the cities. So during that kind of migration period, I don't really calling it even a migration because we weren't really moving away from our lands or territories, but just moving within them. I work for them. I'm also doing my PhD right now in sociology, looking at the impact of religion on Indigenous identity and articulations of Indigenous identity. I'm also a research fellow with the Yellowhead Institute, which is an Indigenous think tank housed at Toronto Metropolitan University. And I do a lot of community engagement, consultation work, research work with Indigenous communities, particularly my community. I'm a researcher with our land claims department. So working on some land issues within the Ottawa Valley with relation to my community, Kitigan-Zibi. And I'm a father of a beautiful 12-year-old daughter, Aya. So, yeah, that's me. Thanks for having me, Victor.
Thank you for your leadership, my friend. As you all know, I'm the executive director of SETSI, or the steward. I'm also a husband, father of 4. My better half and I have 4 remarkable children. So I give thanks for your leadership and vulnerability and your power in sharing all the different intersectionalities of your identity, my friend, and social location lived experience. In terms of NAFC's work, what are some of the emerging remarkable opportunities that are positioned for Indigenous communities? I know that you are one of the investment readiness partners. I'd love to hear more about that work.
Oh, I missed the last part of your question, Victor. Muted right at the last 10 seconds.
In terms of the IRP program, I'd love to hear more about that work and how NAFC is going about facilitating that.
Yeah, sure. So the NAFC is one of 5 IRP funding partners. So in the first iteration of the IRP, so I guess I'm not sure how familiar folks are with the investment readiness program, but on our end, the program, we utilize the program to support, in its first iteration, we used it to support friendship centers in building their social enterprise ideas, starting up social enterprises, and then growing their social enterprises. So these would be friendship center owned, Indigenous owned, community social enterprises, where we wanted the revenues that were generated to go back into the community, back into providing the different programs and services, or to grow the center itself. But going into the second iteration, we've now opened the door to any and all urban Indigenous social purpose organizations in Canada. And so we're in our we just opened the call for our second round of applications. So we're pretty excited about that. But in the last round, we committed a little over 2.5 million to social purpose organizations right across the country for them to develop, build, and grow their respective social enterprises. And these ranged from businesses focused on arts and the arts, catering, food, cultural education, political education, hospitality, and different services for the community. So there's a friendship centers historically, have been offering and doing things that I think we could call or that fit within the term the social economy. But for a long time, we just never really called it that. It was just we were just doing the work that we do, and supporting each other within the community, and also at the same time, kind of generating some form of an inner economy, supporting each other that way. But now with this kind of program, I think it gives us opportunity to access some relatively unrestricted capital, non-repayable capital, which is always nice, to invest into the community and build and grow our ideas, but also it gives us the opportunity to make mistakes when mistakes are made and try things out. And if they don't work, try again, without the fear of a loan over your head or something like that. So yeah, it's been a really great program for friendship centers and urban Indigenous communities now with us opening the door to all these different organizations. And so yeah, we've been funding some really great organizations aside from friendship centers. We've been funding, and I'll give an example. In Ottawa, there's a youth organization, A7G, that we were able to fund their storefront in the Byward Market. In Winnipeg, there's a company, an organization called Build Inc., which works with Indigenous people to get them involved in the trades. And so it's a kind of a construction company, but they build their own houses to sell. It goes back into the program to teach people the trades and such. So some really great organizations and projects across the country that we've funded through this so far.
Thank you so much, Shadi, for all those insights and for your candor. Definitely the investment readiness program, which was announced in the Fall Economic Statement of 2018, was one of three pillars: the Social Innovation Advisory Council that's about to be announced, the Investment Readiness Program, and the Social Finance Fund. And so our hats off to our colleagues at ESDC, Corinne Bagley, Robin Weisner, and their entire team for their work. And I think you mentioned something that was really interesting. You said non-repayable capital. And this is a term that I think is so important for Black and Indigenous communities. When you think about economic reconciliation, one of my elders and colleagues mentions that a lot of the lands that we're on is the original scene of the crime almost, because many colonial nations were built on stolen land and free labor. Our Beyond Solidarity panel yesterday was absolutely remarkable. And that stems from a conversation that my brother Jeff Sear and I have been having for a while around a national Black Indigenous table, primarily because when you look at some of the commonalities between Black communities and Indigenous communities, our reverence and respect for eldership, our understanding of being stewards of the land, I think there's lots of opportunities for collaboration. In terms of land back movements, in terms of land access, what we've identified at SETC is there's such an intersectional approach to this work, and a lot of groups are working in isolation. So I'll give you an example. When it comes to land access, you have the food sovereignty movements working diligently to access land. Then you have folks in the social purpose real estate space working hard, like Graham from Trinity Sensors, Brother Isaac Olawalafe from Dream Legacy Foundation, Cheryl Case from CP Planning, trying to develop out models. Then you also have the affordable housing folks and the co-op folks. So all these folks are trying to access land. And when I talk to my colleagues at different philanthropic foundations, in some instances, these philanthropic foundations are trying to secure land for public use, for social purpose real estate, for agricultural development, for housing, and are being outbid 3-to-1 by the private sector. How is NAFC or yourself as an individual, how are you conceptualizing land back movements in Canada?
It's a big question. Big question, Victor. Yeah, I think just before getting into that, it is important definitely to contextualize what you had mentioned earlier about the non-repayable capital. For us, that's a very important aspect, I think, of the IRP and any kind of work towards, I don't like the term economic reconciliation, but any kind of work towards economic liberation for Indigenous communities is that, like you mentioned, Victor, the wealth of Canada and the United States is built on free land and free labor, right? And then within the Canadian context, the wealth that's been taken out of our lands has built uh, this country up to what it is today, and the standard of living that certain people experience in this country today is built off of the wealth of Indigenous lands. And we see examples now today where Canada is trying to deny that it's accumulated any wealth from our lands. And there's a treaty case right now being litigated in the courts for the Robinson and Huron treaties. And Ontario is arguing that the total accumulation of wealth that they've gained from those treaty lands since the signing of the treaty is negative 11 billion, which, it's BS. But I mean, it's that's kind of what we're up against. And then the fact that under the Indian Act system, Indigenous people, we had no control over our finances until, for some communities, up until the 1970s when the Indian agent left. And my community right now is pursuing another specific claim, a money claim, where our Indian agent at the time utilized all of our band monies to build the neighboring municipality. So all the infrastructure, the roads, the plumbing, the sewage, the buildings, loans to friends to purchase their houses, etc., all came out of our money. And so now we're pursuing a claim to, recuperate some of those funds that were stolen from our community. So we have instances like that. And then the inability to access banks for a long time, to access loans, to have any kind of agency over your own kind of financial or economic freedom in any way. So today, for a lot of Indigenous communities, we're just kind of getting out of the gate in a way, in terms of this whatever this race or however it might be framed. But so there does need to be a pump of capital into our communities that is non-repayable, and not just as a form of, it is a form of economic restitution, right, in a big way. And so it's important that you had mentioned that. So for land back, yeah, I'm very straightforward when it comes to land back. I as a personal ideology, I think any lands that are not being utilized for any kind of significant purpose in this country, so specifically crown lands, should be returned to Indigenous communities. So and I'm talking about provincial parks, national parks, different areas in the Northern Territories that are considered crown lands, where they're kind of only utilized for the purpose of natural resource exploitation. I think those lands should be returned to the respective nations that they belong to. Now, in the urban context, I think it gets far more complicated, especially in places where there's significant settlement in cities, etc. There's examples of urban Indigenous reserves and communities across the country where urban peoples have a presence within those spaces and have access to lands. And then there's examples where, we don't at all. But I think first and foremost, you have to work with the host nation, wherever you are, wherever you live. So kind of finding out who the host nation is and what the land issues they're dealing with are. And so if you're living in, Toronto, Winnipeg, Ottawa, Halifax, wherever, Edmonton, all of those cities sit on someone's territory. And so finding out, whose territory that is and how that land became the city that you live within, or the area that you live within. And then what are those communities doing with, the municipality, the province, and the federal government to address some of those issues, and are they being addressed? I think is the first step for everyone. So that's kind of the high level work. And then on the ground, from the Friendship Center perspective, some of It's a bit twofold, the answer to that question, because some of our the people that we serve in our communities have been displaced from their communities, and so I worked at a friendship center in Milwaukee, Quebec, where we primarily served the population that was from about 2 hours away, but the community has no high school, and so all of their youth had to come and live in our city and kind of like a foster care situation just so they could attend high school. And so talking about, like, I don't know, 150 or so teenagers that all come into the city from the north that live away from their homeland. And so for us in that space, it was about making sure that they remain connected to their own territories. And so it was about facilitating transportation to their territories, access to their territories, advocating on behalf of them, and then at the same time allowing them to live free lives on the land as well. And so we found, a lot of times in this municipality, uh, we would have, a group of Indigenous youth walking around the city, and people would call the cops on them and stuff. And so for us, it was about challenging that, challenging the racism and the stereotypes that people were experiencing within their own land, and know that people should be able to walk around their own territory feeling safe and not afraid. So that's some of the work we do, and then also connecting people to the land. So especially within these bigger cities like Toronto and Vancouver, a lot of friendship centers right now are hosting different um, uh, land-based healing programs, land-based language programs, cultural programs, where we're taking people back out to the land to connect, understand our identities in a better way, revitalize our cultures in connection with the land, and reestablish, I think, a value system that's kind of been attempted to be taken away from us through that reconnection to the land. And when you reestablish that connection to the land for our communities, you also reestablish this political motivation to pursue these land back initiatives, right? We can't really conceptualize land back without being on the land and experiencing what it means to connect with the land and have the land inform your identity. And once you have that, I think the political motivation then kind of starts to grow and emerge from there. I hope that answers your question. It's a big question right there, but
Yeah,
trying to
absolutely.
answer it as best as possible.
No, those are remarkable insights, my brother. So I appreciate your leadership. And as you said, political motivation, that's another synergy or connection between Black and Indigenous communities in terms of politics. So this year is the last year of the UN Decade for People of African Descent. That was the UN DPAD. And Indigenous communities have a very similar declaration. The UN, as you know, made a similar declaration. I'd love for you to share a bit around that for our colleagues and participants here today.
For UNDRIP?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so within the international community context, yeah, Indigenous communities all over the world have been working pretty diligently since I believe about the 1970s is when some of the initial work into UNDRIP started happening. And this is a universal declaration on the rights of Indigenous people. And within it, there's a lot in UNDRIP. But essentially, calls on states to respect Indigenous self-determination and Indigenous rights to language, culture, identity, land, and there are some provisions in there as well about economic freedom and economic self-determination as well, political self-determination. So Canada, United States, New Zealand, and Australia were actually the four states that pushed back against UNDRIP for many, many, many years, and really only signed on under the understanding that it was not a legally binding document and that each state would kind of figure out their own framework or mechanism for how they would apply it within the Canadian context. So Canada did finally sign on to UNDRIP. There's ongoing conversations right now, and from my understanding, the government's trying to figure out how to make Canada's laws fit within the parameters of UNDRIP. I'm not quite sure how they're going to do that because BC did also pass similar legislation saying that British Columbia's laws had to line up with UNDRIP, and I think the issue is who's interpreting the provisions of UNDRIP and under what lens are they interpreting that. So I think the way I might interpret what's in UNDRIP is going to be very different from I don't know, the liberal minister of justice might interpret the provisions of UNDRIP, and so um, that's something that I think is still being worked out at the national level. There are some working groups and different consultation processes with communities, and there's differing views across the board whether UNDRIP um, as something that is not legally binding on the international level can actually implement the changes we want. And there's people that feel like it really can. And so there's a pretty diversity in opinions in Indian country right now about that. So yeah, that's a little bit about Andrew.
No, that's remarkably helpful. And you use the key word within your statements. Use the word self-determination, and that's one of another intersectional or piece that Black Indigenous communities share. We have a word, kujichagalia, and kujichagalia literally means self-determination. And when I think about these terms that came from our ancestors, these blueprints, black prints, these models and frameworks, it's a perfect segue to my next question around eldership. A lot of our conversation yesterday was around eldership, and Setsy's actually been leading a series called When Elders Speak. In terms of your work at NAFC and your own, I guess, work towards on your journey in terms of identity, social location, lived experience, what is your relationship with eldership, and how do you see eldership within your community manifesting?
Yeah, that's a great question, Victor. So I can kind of answer that on two different fronts. But for NAFC, we take the role of elders as well as the ancestors within our work very seriously. So it's actually embedded within our governance structure. So within our national governance structure, we have our board of directors and our executive. We also have a youth council, and then we have our Senate. And our Senate is kind of where we include um, uh, all of the elders from the Friendship Center movement who are represented in that center. So from each kind of region across the country, as well as there's maybe some multiple from different regions, but it's the people that have been in the movement, going on 50 years, 60 years, some of the early people that founded friendship centers, that started the first friendship centers, those knowledge keepers within those communities. And so we've honored them by giving them, these lifetime seats on our Senate. And so they are involved in decision making at our governance level, included in decision making. They have a vote. They can participate in all of our annual meetings and discussions, and they guide, our strategic planning, uh, our policies, our reactions to policies, et cetera. And so we make sure to include uh, our elders and the people that have that knowledge and wisdom in all of our governance structures and decision-making processes. And so that's kind of one way that we remain accountable to the elders in our community and respect and adhere to their opinions as well. And then another aspect of that within the Friendship Center movement, I'd say it's the Friendship Center movement is really driven by elders as well. A lot of how do I explain this? We were actually I was just in Halifax yesterday, and we were meeting with some of our centers, and this had come up is that a lot of our centers we're kind of almost in a little bit of a crisis mode now because so many of them are run by people who have been running them for about 50 years or so, right? And so people who have been at the center from the beginning to the end, and they have all this knowledge and experience, and people who are getting to that retirement place now. A lot of our centers have directors and board presidents and people that really were integral to the centers that are retiring. And so we're figuring out, how do we ensure that the next generation can learn from these people and that there's a good transition that can keep these centers alive and well and operating, but also kind of transforming into a new generation, a new era as well. And so that's something that we're trying to figure out how to bring people who have been in our movement for so long, and people who are just kind of getting into it together, to learn from one another. So.
No, that's remarkably helpful. When we think about succession planning and intergenerational collaboration within the Black community, similar challenges and similar emerging nascent opportunities. We had a remarkable panel yesterday called our Legacy Leadership Panel, and one of our community stalwarts, Craig Wellington, the executive director of the Black Opportunities Fund, mentioned almost a metaphor talking about when Jamaica was running that 4x4 100 relay race, and Asafo Powell was the last man to receive the baton, and Hussein Bolt ran behind him the entire time. And that's the way he conceptualized eldership. We need our elders to continue to be behind us. And then our elder Abena Janelle Scared also conceptualized eldership from the standpoint of ensuring that our elders not just pass the baton, but create a space where younger folks can create new realities because they're walking into a new world. So when I think of that, I think of the importance of the work that my elder Emmanuel Meles is doing at NAPSI, the Network for the Advancement of Black Communities. He actually recently developed something called an Elder in Residence. And the first Elder in Residence is our elder, Anan Loli, the founder of the African Food Basket and now the chair of the Black Food Sovereignty Network. So finding ways to almost create these tenured positions within organizations, institutions for our elders, because as you said, they are the knowledge keepers, they are the knowledge stewards. So thank you for all those actual insights and the remarkable information that you shared with us. My next question is more around other forms of governance, because obviously eldership is a form of governance. In terms of in the Black community, matriarchy and matrilineal models basically have been some of the best models within all our civilizations, and patriarchy has literally devastated the entire planet through extraction and dominant forms of colonial frameworks. I bring that up to say, in terms of your work at NAPSI, I remember years ago, a remarkable organization, the Canadian Community Economic Development Network, CEDNET, had a conference, and I got to sit on a panel with your colleague, Jocelyn Forsma. That's actually how I originally met NAPSI. It was about 5-6 years ago. And I sat on the panel, and I was just inspired by the level of brilliance that comes when we actually allow our communities to define our own leadership frameworks and models. So with that being said, what does gender justice and gender equity, matrilineal or matriarchal models look like within Indigenous communities?
Yeah, really important question as well, Victor. I think within the Indigenous context, there's a lot of work being done to undo the influence and the way that patriarchy was inserted within our communities. And so, through different colonial Christianization and capitalistic processes within our communities, specifically the imposition of the Indian Act, which prohibited Indigenous women from holding leadership positions within our governance structures and communities. So the Indian Act election system for up until the 1950s prohibited Indigenous women from participating in that process. And then the fact that the Indian Act also prohibited Indigenous women from passing on their lineage through gender discrimination in the status system. And so, for up until 1985, if you're an Indigenous woman and you married a non-Indigenous man, you would lose your Indigenous status and not be able to hand that down to your children. And when Indigenous women advocated to push back against that, a lot of Indigenous men-run organizations did not want that to happen, and they pushed against that. And to this day, there's still a lot of issues within our communities with regards to the imposition of patriarchy and patriarchal values that are still informing a lot of our leadership and governance structures across the country. That being said, interestingly enough, the Friendship Center movement has always been a women-driven movement, as opposed to the Indigenous political organizations, which have tended to be a little more male-driven than male-driven. And when you look at, I actually do a presentation sometimes on the history of Indigenous governance in the country, and I do a side-by-side photo of the first Friendship Center boards, and then some of the early Indigenous political organizations like the National Indian Brotherhood and the League of Indian Nations. And the photos are a pretty good image representation of that, because what you see with the Indigenous political representation going back 30, 40, 50 years is that it's all men in the photo. And then when you look at the Friendship Center movement boards and groups, is predominantly women. And so that was historically the Friendship Centers were a space, I believe, and there hasn't been a whole lot of research into this quite yet. It's just kind of internal work that we've uncovered on our own and known as our own, is that within the community, Friendship Centers were a space where uh, given the fact that Indigenous women could not participate in the governance structures of our communities and the political governance structures of our communities, these became spaces where agency and authority and jurisdiction by Indigenous women could be kind of practiced within the urban context. And so a lot of the first Friendship Centers were founded by women. The boards were made up by women. And to this day, the majority of our centers are led by women executive directors and women presidents as well. So within our movement, we value that and definitely respect that and hold that up as an example of an approach to governance that within our understanding of it, we make sure that we include elders, youth, and women within our governance structures and our leadership structures. And are there issues within even our movement? For sure, and those are things that we're pushing back against, even in the ways that we meet with each other. So at our annual meetings, for a long time, we had very rigid and colonial meeting processes that I think, are a result of different colonial and patriarchal systems. And so we're trying to do away right now with a lot of those structures and redevelop processes and decision-making processes and communications processes that are informed by our indigenous identities that are far more holistic and value elder, youth, and women representation within those spaces. And so we actually just got rid of Robert's Rules of Order. We're no longer using those with our meetings and structuring things a bit differently. But yeah, I definitely encourage people to take a look at the Friendship Center movement across the country, and you'll find actually each of our provincial territorial associations. So the national movement is women-led, and each of our provincial territorial associations is woman-led, I believe, yes, except for Manitoba, but Saskatchewan, Alberta, British Columbia, Ontario, all of those regional associations are also led by women, and predominantly, I believe, I'm trying to think back on all the employees within each of the organizations, but yeah, I think it's safe to say that we're a majority women-led organization. I am the minority at the NAFC. So.
Well, that probably speaks to the success of NAFC and the sustainability, 50 years. And I believe that when I speak to my wife, my better half, women are much better stewards than men in many ways. Primarily, they have XX chromosomes, we're XY. So that's probably one of the reasons for NAFC's success. That's gender equity and gender justice lens that's embedded within your framework. A lot of times when we think about the term social innovation, a lot of communities almost have the luxury and the privilege to conceptualize and talk about the theory of social innovation. Other communities, the word social innovation is about survival, literally. We have to almost leverage the practical application of it. So when I think about the remarkable work that my colleague Tiffany Callender from the FACE Coalition is facilitating, FACE is pretty much like the first and only Black CFI in the country, doing some remarkable work around economic development. There's, I believe, over 50 AFIs across the country. I'd love to hear more about the economic development piece that has been developed within Indigenous communities.
Yeah, I mean, there's different kind of aspects of economic development within our communities, and I think a lot of times what gets really highlighted and talked about are these very large scale initiatives, specifically around resource extraction or exploitation. So whether that's in forestry, mining, oil, natural gas, etc. So I mean that's one aspect of it, but on the ground, there's a lot of work being done with the individual business owners, individual entrepreneurs, and so for a long time in my own community, I worked assisting and working with entrepreneurs to develop their business plans and kind of gain access to funds. Oh, sorry. I just opened up the chat here. The urban indigenous community in particular, our focus right now is how do we develop and build uh, a sustainable, an economically sustainable movement that can last, 7 generations going forward, and different parties, or the goodwill of overall Canadian society. So whenever they feel like they need to um, um, work with Indigenous peoples or make up for some of the issues that happen, we see a little bit of an influx in funds. And then when we get a government that feels a little more hostile to that, we see a decrease in funds. And that's not a sustainable approach, obviously. And some of our organizations have actually just vanished off the face of the earth because of certain political changes in this country. One example was NAHO, so the National Aboriginal Health Organization, that was just in the Harper era, lost all funding and had to close its doors, and they were doing really great health work and health research. So for us, it's really about one, on the ground, looking at how different centers can diversify their revenue streams so that we're not relying on like 98% government funding, and where we have opportunities to generate revenues within the community, but not just in kind of any way. So we do have a parameter or kind of guidelines for how we look at social enterprise development, economic development within our community. And one, it has to address some kind of social need. So it's not just business for business sake. Two, it has to have a positive social impact in the community. And so not getting into businesses that may harm our communities. And then three, it has to generate some form of collective wealth within the community, and whether that's through employment or some kind of redistribution of capital back into the community. That's kind of the three principles that we're looking to abide by in the development of those businesses. And then another aspect of that also is to find ways and tools and mechanisms to create opportunities for us to invest within our own communities. So one thing that I'm pushing for at our level is that there are a lot of people who are kind of, I think, waking up to or realizing this need for one, land back, and two, cash back. And I've seen in certain cities and places people willing to give back their lands, people inheriting wealth and property from their great grandparents, and being a little more progressive about what to do with it and trying to give that back to communities. And so I'm currently thinking through a process, how can we have a product built specifically for accepting cash back and land back, and then being able to use that to reinvest into our communities and ensure the sustainability of our communities over the long term. Yeah, so and not to view it as charity. I don't like viewing it as charity. So not a charitable structure, but rather something different. So there's some examples of this in Seattle. There's an organization that allows for people to pay rent to a land, Indigenous community that doesn't have a land base in Seattle. So these funds actually go back into a community trust to give them the opportunity to buy land back within their territories. Yeah, so there's some examples of things like that happening right now. And so something that we're looking into as well. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. It does more than answer my questions. It segues perfectly into the next question. When we speak about land, and you alluded to the healing of land earlier and some of those initiatives, my wife actually taught me a lot about soil amendments and soil regenerative frameworks of just the soil and the land and the healing that's required. I've never heard of Father Earth or Father Africa or Father, when we conceptualize our planet as people of African descent, we use the term Asasiya, or Mother Earth, Mother Nature. We see her as a mother, a feminine deity. So when I say that, I'm going towards a question around agricultural development and food sovereignty. Is there any work that you're seeing right now emerging within Indigenous communities, specifically around food sovereignty and agricultural development, that's inspiring you?
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of communities that are trying to work around this within the urban space. Interestingly, some of our friendship centers are positioned in like a wide array of spaces, and so we have some friendship centers that are in populations of like 3,000 people or less, and we have the bulk of our centers are in this like kind of 20 to 50,000 people population centers, and then we have a few that are in the million plus places, and so each of their experiences on food sovereignty are quite different, as you can imagine. Um, and so within the urban space, we have people doing these urban gardens, and these some of them are building them on top of friendship centers, and in the backyards of friendship centers, and different programs to connect people with traditional foods and diets and practices. um, One of the big issues, I think, for Indigenous communities is this: the diet patterns changed significantly over the last couple of hundred years. Obviously, with the introduction of sugar, flour, different grains, alcohol, etc. All these types of things that the dairy that really exist within the societies here. So working to kind of restore indigenous diets that are better for us as a people and connecting us with the land generally, but then also with some of our smaller centers. So the center I used to work at, yeah, we would do all types of stuff where we would take people out on the land to go harvest fish, to go moose hunting, trapping, deer hunting, and we would bring that back into the center. And so we would sometimes be, taking apart moose within the Friendship Center, and they would drive some of the neighbors a bit nuts, but we didn't really care. We were doing our thing within our space. But teaching the youth, how to harvest appropriately, ethically, and in line with our values as Anishinaabe people, and then also how to survive off those foods, and how to live a healthy lifestyle in connection with those foods as well. So that work is ongoing in just about every friendship center, I'd say, across the country. But their experiences are really different based on where they're located and where they're at. So, like I said, we have some of our rural centers are still very connected with those on the land practices, and some of our more urban and large city centers are um, trying to figure out how to maintain that within a space that, as we know, we're surrounded by, whether it's food deserts or an overabundance of crappy food. But yeah.
No, that's remarkably helpful. And even that the way you conceptualized these new dietary patterns of white starch, white sugar, and dairy. These are things that impact so many communities. I look at the remarkable work that my brother Jeff Sear from Raven Capital is doing around outcomes-based financing, specifically around health disparities and type 2 diabetes within Indigenous communities. So thank you for all those actual insights. Remarkable. This is actually my last question for you, and it's specific around climate action. And the climate carnage that's happening across the planet, and the fact that it's disproportionately impacting various communities. In terms of your work at NAFC and in terms of your journey, I'd love to hear if there's some specific work being done that you're aware of, or that you'd like to amplify or further validate within Indigenous communities, specifically around climate action. And I'll do a shameless plug right now. If anyone is interested, at the Athabasca University, SEDNet's Synergia Institute, Mike Lewis and his colleagues actually have a massive open online course specifically on climate action work, the study groups. But I'm saying all this to say, if you want, please check out the SETSI Instagram or website to find out more about the Synergy Institute and the massive online course. But in terms of the work that NAFC is doing and Indigenous communities are doing, are there any promising models or communities of practice around climate action and climate justice that you'd like to amplify in this moment?
Yeah, I think one is that some of our centers in relation to climate, specifically climate change, is that a lot of our centers, based on where they're located, have been dealing with some of the significant impacts of these changes. And so we have centers that were located, right in the middle of some of those really large fires that took place out in British Columbia and around the Okanagan. And so as well, some of our northern centers had to deal with significant flooding. Our BC centers dealt with all of those floodings that took place. The center I used to work at, we used to deal with consistent flooding of the Gatineau River up in northern past Ottawa. And so one of the issues is that with climate change, there's all of these types of different changes that are occurring, disasters that are occurring, movements of people, etc. And so our centers are, one, on the front line trying to support those communities within these emergencies that are taking place, but then two, their infrastructure is being significantly affected. And so right now we're really looking at, especially some of these places where there's higher risks, like in the Okanagan and some of these floodplains in different places where these centers are located, looking at, how can the infrastructure adapt to that reality, and how do the services also adapt to the reality that there's going to be these consistent disruptions within our community, and then how do we utilize the knowledges within our community to address some of those issues and changes. And so within some spaces, generally, out in BC as well, there's communities that are working on doing their own trying to remember the name of it right now, where they preemptively burn the land, to prevent forest fires, and that comes from Indigenous knowledges. And so different communities working towards that, or working with my friendship center that was located in Maniwaki, working with some of our elders who were knowledgeable about where the river would flood historically always, and sharing that knowledge with, sharing it again, because a lot of these settler communities were informed prior to building their cities that they weren't building them in good locations, but chose to ignore that. But sharing that knowledge that we have, that's been passed down from our ancestors about how the land changes in different seasons, but also readjusting ourselves as well, because we're seeing changes now that aren't really accounted for within some of our narratives and some of our traditions, and because of these changes that are taking place. And so making sure that our communities are heard and that our realities are addressed. And so I think for us, it's really, right now, I think we're just starting to figure out how to adapt and change with these changes that are coming down the line from us. But at the same time, asserting that our knowledges and our perspectives and our sciences and our worldviews are key to solving some of these issues, or thinking around some of these issues. And so we need to make sure that Indigenous communities are included in those processes. Otherwise, I don't think we have much of a hope. Yeah.
I agree completely. And thank you so much for all those actionable insights around adaptation and mitigation. So to close off, I'd just love for you to share a call to action to Indigenous and Black leaders across Canada in terms of how we can find ways to be better champions and stewards and operate in a place of solidarity together. What's your call to action, my friend?
Just to collaborate more. I think the Indigenous community and the Black community can benefit significantly from more collaboration, more communication, and more work together. And yeah, just sharing more with each other, doing more things like this. I think there is some collaboration that takes place, but not enough. And I think we need to continue that work, and yeah, and having those conversations. And sometimes it's having hard conversations as well, and addressing some of the historical issues that have taken place between communities as well, and having those conversations. So I think that would just be my call to action, is more collaboration. Yeah, and so we're open to working with organizations within community. We can connect people with organizations in community. And so if you work in a specific place and you're interested in working with a local friendship center, we can share my email after, but feel free to email me, and we can try and connect people if you're interested in connecting on that level. Yeah, so I think that's it, really. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to share. If there's some questions in the chat, I don't know if we want to address those at all, but
yeah, so definitely, please, if you can, put your email in the chat so that we can follow up with anyone in the chats. And as always, at all things at SETC, we like to begin on time and start on time. Shadi's going to share his email in the chats. If there's anyone that would like to further ask any questions or connect, it's easy to reach us, info@setc.ca. Shadi has put his email in the chats. And once again, my brother, I'd like to thank you for your leadership, your diligence, your resilience, your tenacity, your candor and transparency over the course of this hour. And at SETC, we begin all things as we start by giving thanks to the Creator, giving thanks to our ancestors, giving thanks to our elders, and all the community stalwarts whose shoulders we stand on as we share, learn, and grow together for our collective liberation and sovereignty. Thank you, my brother. I appreciate you.